Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Transforming Libraries for Graduate Students webinar series. Since 2016, TLGS runs a biennial conference dedicated to graduate librarianship and its many facets. It provides a space for sharing innovative ideas and best practices for supporting graduate faculty and students in higher education. This webinar series is a way to keep our community of graduate librarians connected and engaged during that off year. So the next conference will be taking place in the spring of 2024. And I just want to introduce myself quickly. My name is Elaine Walker, and I am the Scholarly Communications Librarian here at the University of Alabama, and I'll be the moderator for today's session. I've been involved with TLGS since 2020, first as a presenter, then as a conference planning committee member for 2022, and now the host for the webinar series. So without further ado, I'll introduce our panel for today's session. We have Frances Brady, Reference and Instruction Librarian at Adler University, Kari Weaver, who's the Learning, Teaching, and Instructional Design Librarian at the University of Waterloo, and Alissa Droog, who is the Assistant Professor and Education and Social Sciences Librarian at Northern Illinois University. And so without further ado, the stage is yours.
Thank you so much, Elaine. Hi, everyone. I hope you're enjoying your lunches, or at least here in Chicago, it's lunchtime. We are going to be talking to you about the graduate student research experience, exploring the impact of a drawing-based research study on our librarian practice. As Elaine said, my name is Frances Brady. I use they, she pronouns. I am the Reference and Instruction Librarian at Adler University. I work on the Chicago campus, and I help entirely graduate students because our whole campus consists of only graduate students.
Sorry, I have to unmute myself. I'm Kari Weaver. As mentioned, I'm the Learning, Teaching, and Instructional Design Librarian at the University of Waterloo, which is in Ontario, Canada. And in this position, I oversee all of the educational functions of my 5 or 6 location library system. But in particular, over the last several years, a lot of my work has looked at how we can shift what we're doing on a higher programmatic level to better support graduate students at our institution across disciplines. And I use she, her pronouns.
Hey again, everybody. My name is Alissa Droog. I use she, her pronouns, and I am the Education and Social Sciences Librarian at Northern Illinois University. I also work with graduate students almost exclusively in my role in a variety, about 17 different graduate programs, master's, doctorals, EDD programs. And here's what we're going to be doing with you today. We are going to start with a bit of a drawing activity, and then we are going to share a little bit about the study that we've run in the last couple of years, some of the methodology and the findings very quickly. And the bulk of today is going to be talking about the impacts that that study has had on our practice as librarians in the programmatic, instructional, and kind of reference realms. Our learning goals for today are that you will be able to identify your own emotions associated with the research process through a drawing exercise that we're going to do in a moment, to reflect on the 5 themes identified through the study that we conducted on perceptions of research for graduate students, and to brainstorm ways that you can put these findings into practice for yourself after brainstorming how that works out with us. So with that said, we are going to start with that drawing exercise I promised. This is actually an activity that all 3 of us have used in our classrooms and how we all met. And it was also an activity that we then used in our research study. So what I'd like you to do is grab a piece of paper, a pencil. If you're on a computer and you want to use Microsoft Paint, go for it. Any way you want to do this, I want you to take a moment. We're going to mute ourselves and we're all going to draw what research is to us. Give you about 20 more seconds. All right. You might not be done, and that's totally okay. But I hope you had a chance to kind of think about what research is to you and draw something. What we are going to do now with those drawings is I have a question for you. If you want to share your camera and like put up your picture to your screen, you're welcome to share what you did. But in the chat, if you'd like to share what emotions are associated with that drawing of research. So I'm seeing some emotions like we've got curiosity, uncertainty, happiness, excitement. I put gratitude today in mine, boredom, sometimes frustration, some anxiety, usually confusion. Somebody drew two. They drew a graduate toque on their head, serenely going la 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 as I type, and then a grad with arms in all directions and a black cloud over their head, shouting with their heads. Yes, I felt both of those. Frustration, so much frustration today, both curiosity and uncertainty, curiosity, and somebody else is identifying with somebody else's. So there's lots of different emotions that we've shared here. I think some of us on the team have said today, because every time I do this, I draw something different and my emotions change. But this is really great. This is why we asked you to do this activity. The reality is that visual stimuli connects to a part of our brain that is evolutionarily older than how we process information, more text-based information. And that part of our brain is more connected to our emotions. Hence why we asked you to draw and then asked you to think about those emotions that were connected with those drawings. This is the exact same prompt that we used at the beginning of our study and in classroom activities that we've done. And I'm going to turn it over to Kari now to chat a little bit about what the rest of that process looked like.
So we'd like to start by saying that we've given some presentations about the findings of the study, but we did want to give them an overview today. And we will be looking at some visuals of drawings that our participants in the study did create. We would like to acknowledge that all illustrations are photographs of the original drawings or diagrams created by the study participants, and that participants own the copyright to their drawings or diagrams, and the members of the research team here today have consent from those research participants to use the photos of the drawings and diagrams, and this applies to all of the drawings that you will see throughout this presentation today. And we like to share that every time that we are talking about what we have done in this work, because there are some strong ethical implications to using drawings and visual methods in research that haven't been super well considered yet in our field. So about what we did, we recruited participants from 3 institutions in Canada and the United States, the 3 institutions that we work at, and participants agreed to participate in approximately a 1-hour-long interview, where at the beginning they created a drawing exemplifying their conception of research and then discussed the meaning of the drawing in addition to participating in a semi-structured interview where they told us more about their overall experiences with research and how the drawing connected to that, or in some cases didn't. So this used semi-structured interviews, and the drawing method is called graphic elicitation. We ended up having 19 graduate students who were based all over the United States and Canada geographically, and represented a number of different subject disciplines of study. And we will return to that issue later because we are sure people will have some questions about it. So that is what we actually did. I am going to turn it over to Francis, who is going to very quickly walk you through some of the major themes that we found and some examples of the drawings from our research participants.
Thanks, Kari. Our first theme is that research is abstract, amorphous, and hard to define. Graduate students struggle to describe what research is to them and often used metaphors connecting the experience to something else. So an example here is a student drew a funnel starting with the first search being in a data vortex, which leads to general data and then eventually to distilled data. Our next, given students' emphases on metaphor, our second theme uses a metaphor to describe our findings. Research is an Odyssey. So similar to the story of Odysseus's 10-year journey following the Trojan War, the experience of conducting research as a graduate student is liminal. It is a process of growth and becoming. While some graduate students describe themselves as researchers, others didn't identify as researchers, and many were in the process of that becoming researchers. Also, graduate students' experience of research mirrored the difficulties of an Odyssey through facing interruptions, barriers, hard to resolve puzzles, and a lack of investment from their crew or social supports. So this drawing is the side of a mountain, and there's a tent just under an avalanche that's sitting on a plateau. That tent represented the participant pausing in the dissertation process for the birth of her child. And then after picking back up, there were some sudden unexpected changes in that participant's research, thus the avalanche. And the importance of social support to graduate student research experience was pronounced enough to be its own theme. So we heard about social support coming from a number of factors, whether from supervisors, chairs, family, friends, peers. This drawing, I realize, might be a little bit difficult to see. There's a lot going on in the drawing. There's a pie chart with aspects of research, including understand, gray area, peer-reviewed, and there's a heading above that that says holistic, complicated, and it leads to simple results. But I use this drawing in particular for this theme because the student is talking to us about first sitting alone and struggling in the library to getting some support from peers in editing through their process. So while we expected to find emotions present throughout the research process due to prior research, it was striking that even in positive moments, participants expressed a sense of overwhelm. They particularly expressed uncertainty of their skills or what they had achieved at each stage. So here there's a participant depicting themselves looking at a brick wall that's between themselves and their research. And although grad students find many aspects of the research process frustrating, their identity and their values provided them with joy and fortitude. So while they pursued research for a variety of reasons, to acquire knowledge, to improve the world, to attain a career, it was always their identity that guided these reasons and pushed them to persevere. So in this drawing, you see there's a person who's thinking through a mess or an issue. And from that idea that comes from having grappled with the mess, they're able to then pursue goals in career, their personal interests, and serve their community. This theme will be unsurprising to most of you, I suspect, and that's that information in the research process is problematic. When students talked about research, they often mentioned information and the challenges of finding, evaluating, and using it appropriately. Many spoke of the difficulties of how others interpret it, particularly about bias. And when they spoke of the difficulties of information, they referred to how it impacts the entire research process, from the gathering states of the lit review to how others interpret the findings of research. So in this drawing, you see different light bulbs of different shapes, different sizes, and these each represented research studies to the participant who drew it. The bulbs which are lit have impacted other research depicted by the blue waves emanating from the studies, showing how research connects to other research studies. So I'll now pass it back to Kari to lead a discussion of how these findings have impacted our practice.
So thanks to Frances for doing a phenomenal job walking us through that, the context very swiftly. So you can see from that overview of the research that we were thinking about the entirety of the research experience and process for graduate students. And this is a really critical element as we move into talking about the implications to our own practice, because one of the things that we discovered in the course of doing this study and looking at the existing literature is that in our field, in the library and information science field, a lot of the existing research looking at graduate student research experiences focus particularly on the literature review portion of the process and sort of pull that out and consider that as a distinct element. And here in this study, we were actually not interested in looking just at that one element. We were looking at the process and experience of graduate students more holistically. So we have made a number of programmatic, instructional, and reference changes to the way that we do our work as librarians. And we're going to go over some of those things now. So as you might have surmised from our introductions, I'm in a position where a lot of what I can do is make sort of very high level systemic changes within my organization and library. And so I have made a number of programmatic changes based on the findings of this research study. So one of the things is that referring back to that existing research where we looked more exclusively in our field at the literature review process, one of the big things that we heard from our participants was that they really struggled with kind of moving stage to stage or moving forward and back throughout the process and understanding what was expected throughout that. And so one of the things that has changed is as we're thinking about programming and how we're structuring what supports we're giving to graduate students at my institution, we've really focused much more deliberately in the last year and a half on collaboration with other units. That's not that we'd never collaborated with other units on campus before, but we more explicitly have done collaborative programming with our Student Success Office, our Graduate and Postdoctoral Affairs Office, our Writing and Communication Center, and part of the intention of that is to help students understand what exactly can the library do, what does the Writing and Communication Center do, what does the Student Success Office do, and how all of those different supports are in place to help them move through different portions of the process. And I think that that's really important, because one of the other things that we heard is, even if they have a great supervisor, that supervisor may not necessarily be super aware of what's happening, or what supports might be available to those students on campus. So another element is a much greater emphasis on the affective dimension, so that emotional component of research. And thinking about how we're going to address that, or being more explicit about addressing that in thinking how we're going to approach graduate students. And we'll talk a little bit when we move to some of the instructional changes about specifically what we do in that area. But just using this as kind of like one of the overarching pieces that we're always considering as we're planning what information literacy looks like for graduate students, and what needs to be addressed in anything that we're doing with graduate students. If it doesn't have an element of that affective dimension of research, I'm asking questions about that, and asking people to tell me why and how we can address that. And the third piece is that we actually found in this study, very much in opposition to some of what has been found in the past, that there weren't great disciplinary differences at all. In fact, students who are coming from areas like theoretical physics had very, very similar, remarkably similar experiences with the whole research process as students in other fields like counseling psychology or educational leadership. And so it's not really necessary in many, many instances to focus the programming for graduate students on the needs of particular disciplines. And that also indicated at a programming level that we didn't necessarily have to do all or the majority of our instruction within particular classes at the graduate student level. And that opened up the opportunity to do more co-curricular workshops that could be timed, thinking about the expectations of the research or the dissertation or thesis process on my campus, as a way to more effectively meet those students where they are. And those co-curricular workshops have been actually a wonderful experience, because having students from across different disciplines talk about that and make connections helps students not to feel so alone, and is one of the things that can actually help address that affective dimension of the research process. You know, it's one thing to sort of feel like, well, everyone else in my program is experiencing the same sort of thing. But when you realize it's no, everybody else studying at the graduate level at my institution is feeling the same way about this, it really helps break down some of those barriers. So with that, we're going to move on to talking a little bit about the instructional changes, and Alissa is going to lead us into.
Yeah. So Kari has the unique position where she can do a lot of programmatic things, but I am the subject librarian as an education librarian. So I was changing things primarily in what I was doing in my day-to-day classes that I was teaching. I think one of the first things I think all three of us can say that we've started to do is to deprioritize the database in our library instruction. We had a big conversation after our interviews about, when we asked students about research, even though they knew that they were talking to librarians, they didn't tell us about database struggles when we talked about research. Of course, we were asking holistically, but I would have thought they would have said a little bit more about that. Instead, they told us about challenges around, how do I deal with the bias in this information? How do I detect that? How do I know when I have enough literature? How do I deal with when there's too many relevant things or not enough relevant things? How do I make sure that my topic is refined enough to get to that next stage? Not one of them mentioned Boolean logic, which both surprised and didn't surprise me. I think the traditional method in library instruction is to show a database so that students can replicate it, and then add a couple things to the beginning and the end of that type of instruction. And I think for all of us, and we've had this discussion, we have had a philosophical change in how we are thinking about and delivering library instruction, in that we are deprioritizing the database. And what does that look like? For me, this means my database demonstrations are no more than 5 minutes now. My classes spend way more time thinking about where information is, refining research questions, how to choose the best information once you've got a list of search results in front of you. We are spending less time thinking about Boolean logic and how to get through the database than we are on how to look at the information and deal with the information that comes through with it. For me, this also means that I'm assuming that students can use the piece of technology. I'm not there to tell them where to click. They choose and purchase and download apps every day and make decisions like that. My job is to help them make the best decisions about which ones of which technology pieces they might want to use and how they might want to use it with, given its benefits and its limitations. So if we aren't spending as much time with databases in our instruction, what are we doing instead? And I'm going to pass it over to Frances.
So as we've mentioned that there's a theme about emotions and overwhelm, and as Kari talked about the affective dimension in the programmatic level, I'm really leaning hard into the affective or the emotional level in my instruction sessions, because the sense of overwhelm can impede students' ability to progress through the research process. They feel so alone in those emotions. And knowing that they need social supports, we as librarians can provide that, at least one aspect of that support, by normalizing the emotions and also illuminating a path or a structure through the research process so that students can move forward despite that feeling of overwhelm. So I now start all of my sessions by discussing emotions.
I also start a lot of my sessions with the drawing activity that we did and acknowledge and normalize the emotions that students are bringing up in that discussion.
And so I start my first semester courses with that drawing activity. And then when I see students again in upper level classes, because I've already done the drawing activity, I then provide colored pencils and a lot of blank space on my handouts. And I suggest students take 60 seconds at the start of my sessions to just doodle a tight spiral. And if students are uncomfortable with this, I tell them to just sit in silence if that's easier for them. But I explain that this is because the research shows that our full selves, our emotions, are involved with research. And so I want students to feel fully present in the room and be more aware of their bodies. And then I encourage doodling throughout my class sessions, which actually seems to decrease the amount of phone usage in my classes.
And you might be thinking about some of the descriptions that I was giving of what I've done on the programmatic level and thinking, well, how do you do this in a co-curricular workshop? You have really particular time constraints and students are coming to this voluntarily. Do they really want to engage with this? Well, I might not make it the focus of the workshop, which they're there for a particular reason, but I'll make sure to include a slide right up front at the beginning of the conversation about whatever the topic is today, talking about the existing research on affect in research, and how that can definitely influence the experiences that they are having or will have as they progress in their graduate study, and sometimes even have rethought or changed the titles of the workshops that we're advertising to reflect that affective dimension. So we've given a workshop at my institution about information saturation in the research process, and we actually retitled it this past year, When is Enough Enough, which was based on a sentiment that was shared by one of the research participants in this study.
So in addition to acknowledging emotions, we also have started to really join the students in their journey along the research process.
Thanks all. Sorry, minor technical hiccup. So bringing ourselves into that conversation as people becomes really critical. And so within the instruction that I'm doing for graduate students, I'm a scholar and I finished a doctorate. And one of the co-curricular workshops that we offer with our Writing and Communication Center is looking at how people actually structure and organize the information in their literature review, and that can justify the original research that they're looking to do. And even though we've always used examples of that over the years that we've worked in different formats with the Writing and Communication Center, one of the things that happened as a result of this study is that my own dissertation actually has become the example for that we openly discuss with students. And I'm able to talk more in depth and answer more in-depth questions for students about why I made the decisions that I made in how I organized the information and how I made choices about what I did and didn't include, and how I got to the place where I figured out if it was enough, or at least good enough to get past my committee. And that has the function of really helping to humanize me as a person and help the students recognize that I'm not just there, because I know something about searching for information. I'm also there very much as somebody who's gone through the same sorts of things that they have gone through. And that helps bolster that social support element. And more clearly connect for me my research and my practice, which I think is valuable for us to think about as a field in general.
And similar to Kari, I also use examples for my own research now and as activities in instruction sessions, whereas I didn't before. But unlike Kari, I don't have a doctorate. I haven't written a dissertation, and I've done a lot less research. I'm a fairly novice researcher. And so I had not thought to use my own research. I had for years been using published lit reviews in classes to have students look at what published works had done to synthesize prior literature. But in order to help students see how to move through that process, I wanted them to see my struggles and how confused I had felt. Like with Kari, not only am I now able to show how I organize things, my notes, how I map the articles, and then also show here's the published work, here's what that actually looks like. But it also, as Kari said, it humanizes the process. And so students really connect with me and are able to see that I struggled with the same things, even though I'm teaching them things. And I'm also showing that this isn't just one step that this isn't just a discrete step that doesn't connect to anything else in their dissertation or in the rest of their research, but rather seeing the lit review as a piece of a larger journey.
So in sort of joining the journey and approaching this by bringing ourselves and our own research experiences into the conversation, we are positioning ourselves as better social supports. But the biggest thing, the number one overarching thing that it does is it answers that kind of unspoken question that permeates a lot of what we do as librarians, which is, why a librarian? Why as a student would I approach or talk to a librarian about my questions or problems with research? And it's a nice way of doing that without having to try to market ourselves unduly or convince people of something which they are wary. We can simply bring ourselves and our experiences and emotions and expertise to the space, and that will in fact do the work for us.
Right. And the last area that we wanted to chat about how this has personally impacted our practice is in our reference appointment changes. We've got two kind of notes here, and they're starting to kind of come, some themes are kind of coming through. The first one is to acknowledge emotions in that process. Prior to starting this project, I think I assumed that most of the students who reached out to me were probably pretty brave to have reached out to me and might have been struggling. But I think now, after having seen the emotions associated with that process, I now assume that every student who reaches out to me is probably overwhelmed and or anxious and has a lot of emotions that are going along, and they're not just brave. Their emotions are an important piece of the research process, and managing those and addressing them head on can help them actually work through the actual questions that they have for us. Instead of asking in like a very practical level, instead of just asking how's it going at the start of appointments, I now normally ask how they feel about their research as my first question, to kind of get at where, yes, you have a question about how to deal with this particular object, but like, what's the emotions that are associated with that? How can we kind of tackle both of those at the same time? And at the end of the appointment, I ask the same thing. How are you feeling about your research now? It's always really gratifying to hear that most students sound better. Not only do they say they feel better, but they sound better by the end of it.
And similarly, it's really important to me to connect fully with my students in reference appointments. And so I always start by asking, how are you? And some do immediately start kind of vomiting their anxiety at me after that question, but sometimes they're just it's fine, right? Just the rote response. And when I get that kind of rote response, I just probe, but how are you really? And that usually elicits some laughter, and it breaks down that barrier of feeling like I'm supposed to be a certain way with the librarian. And the student just immediately visibly relaxes. And by being more relaxed, the students are able to more fully engage and learn in the session, as well as to trust me better. So in addition to connecting with emotions, our research showed the grad students struggle to find a path for their research journey. So while I do still cover database best practices, and I know there's an excellent question in the chat that we can delve into further later, but yes, deprioritizing the database for me, it doesn't look like not covering the database. It's just not being the priority, that it's one priority among many priorities in my reference and instruction sessions. So while I'm covering the database best practices like subject headings, which are near and dear to my heart, much of the focus of my session shifts towards delving into the topic, figuring out the structure of the process. So for example, in considering the topic, we draw a Venn diagram to represent the topic. And for some of the sessions, that actually takes the full appointment, and they may come back for a second appointment weeks or months later after pulling that back to their chair and delving into that topic in other brainstorming sessions. But in most sessions, we use that Venn diagram as a translation tool to talk to the databases, understanding concepts of subject headings, etc. And then we are in the databases, but after finding some citations, I find most students seem actually more overwhelmed when I find a lot of sources for them, because they don't know how to evaluate the abstracts. So we then read through a few abstracts together, evaluating those. Again, we're in the database, but deprioritizing, like here's where you click, and more thinking through how to evaluate the information we're finding. And that usually leads to questions from the students about how many sources, and discussions of finding saturation, as well as even discussions of the point of the lit review and how that leads them to other parts of the process of their research, with a lot of additional questions about paths and journeys.
I know I do a lot of this too. I do the Venn diagram, and I often start a lot of my reference, like after we've talked through a bunch of things, we've dealt with the topic, we often talk a little bit about, like, I'm like, show me what you did. Like, what were your searches that you were running? And 90% of the time, the students are running perfectly reasonable searches. The challenge that I often find is exactly what Francis was just saying. They struggle to understand when something is relevant. I had a meeting just a couple weeks ago where we spent the entire meeting discussing now that they found all the right search results, but how do they understand which ones are and aren't going to be relevant given the topic that they've shared with me?
Yeah, so in many sessions, I'm also discussing with students how to move from what they found to everything else that they're doing with the literature, or connecting the literature back to the rest of their research. Meaning, how do they organize their search process? How do they organize their sources? How do they start thinking about connections between sources? And so this leads to questions about the bigger picture. It leads to students asking me questions well outside my areas of expertise, writing techniques, which I don't help with, format, citations, which I don't help with. That's the Writing Center at Adler, methodology. And when I get these questions, I love them because it allows me to suggest to the students pathways from what we're talking about into other parts of the process and other places that they can get that support at Adler. So we've just given you some of our ideas. We told you about our findings. We told you about how we got those findings. And then we also told you how we've started to change our practice from those findings. And I see we've already started with some of this in the chat, but I'd love to hear more about how you're reacting to this, as well as how you think that you might be able to use these findings in your own practice, or how you might already be using some of these same things that we're doing.
Hi, everyone. I'm going to stay black screen because I'm working from home today in my pajamas, which I did not need to showcase to the world. But I do think it is really important to, communicate to grad students that being a grad student completely sucks, no matter what kind of program you're in, because you're an adult, but you feel at the mercy of your committee. I mean, it's just going to be a bad time. So I always make sure that we acknowledge that. And my method is just to say, what can I help you with now? Because I have experienced librarians who want to give you the whole kitchen sink to walk away with. That is super overwhelming. So the tiny bite-sized point of need thing, contextualized, that's really the best thing I can do for them.
Yeah, and Wendy, to build on that, one of the most important things that we found in this study is that graduate students, unlike other populations, are experiencing an emotional state of being overwhelmed throughout the entirety of their experience, right? If we think about other models of information seeking, we see that sense of overwhelm sort of wanes eventually in the majority of models that we have that are based on studies of other populations. And that is not what we found with graduate students. And so, really going into it, as Alissa was describing, thinking about the fact that they're already overwhelmed. So giving them everything in the kitchen sink is just adding to that, as opposed to helping give them some temporary relief, I think is a really important sort of concept to think about. Jenny?
Hi, thank you so much for this presentation. This was fantastic. I apologize if you all mentioned this, but have you noticed any recurrent themes that you've then used as an entry point in talking to faculty about, how to structure classes, how to maybe redesign assignments, how to do things like that to maybe kind of meet more students at the point of need and at the point of failure, I guess is probably a deficit thinking way to think about it, but that kind of thing. Does that question make sense? I'm sorry, it's Friday, I'm rambling.
That question made perfect sense, and it's a wonderful question. I will be very curious to hear more from Kari and Alissa in answer to that, but for myself, I have been talking to faculty more within the frame of when I'm teaching. They see what I'm talking about, and I reference this study in my classes. And it's been interesting which faculty kind of they want to support the students, but when I say that the students feel overwhelmed with research, they look at me and they go, oh, I don't remember feeling overwhelmed. Do you all really feel overwhelmed? Yes, they do. And most of the faculty being really supportive of that. I've also seen some faculty that as I start to talk less about databases, more about some of the structure, some of the syllabi have actually just shifted. I haven't asked them. I don't feel like I have that kind of relationship with most of my faculty to ask them to change assignments, but I've actually seen the assignments change and pull from examples that I've given to actually use that as an assignment in some of their classes. This is actually something that, you know, we just did this study. We're still wrapping up the manuscript. So I do want to use some of this further, and I have a meeting coming up in a few weeks with program heads of a couple of doc programs in order to talk about how we can use these findings. But those conversations are still just starting.
And I'm just totally working around the faculty with complete abandon in the fact that some of the study findings actually indicated that they really didn't need this intervention within a particular class, right? So within my context, you know, I'm at a very large institution. I have 42,000 students in total. About 6,000 of those are grad students, and across, you know, 6 different faculty divisions, which is kind of our major academic divisions at a Canadian university. And it's a lot more staffing and time prudent for us to really lean into that co-curricular workshop model, which isn't to say that we never do instruction in like specific grad student classes or labs. That does happen. But this has given me kind of that, well, it's not kind of, this has given me the evidence to say, you know, we don't necessarily need faculty in our context to change what they're doing. We can have an impact going in a different direction. And that's kind of, there's a certain amount of freedom in that is kind of nice some days and frustrating others. But isn't that being an academic librarian in the modern era?
I don't think I have a lot to add other than that. I think I was already beginning to move towards deprioritizing the database in instruction anyways. I think that's where the information literacy framework is heading. Like that's the direction that we were heading as instruction librarians anyways. I think it has changed how I have conversations, because I do have conversations with our program coordinators about the types of instruction that we're doing. Periodically, there will be a faculty member that really just wants me to show the database, and we sit down and we have a negotiation about that normally. And normally I have brought up this study in the past, and I'll say, yeah, like, you know, what they're dealing with isn't necessarily just where to click here. Like they're trying to deal with larger problems, and the things that they come to me with are not where to click.
Yes, Wendy, that's so true. Once you have that partnership, once the faculty see that you're useful, the dynamic really shifts. And I think that's, as Alissa said, I had already been doing less of database demos in classes and pushing back against faculty who would come to me and say, oh, could you just do a demo of PsycInfo for half an hour? And I'd say, well, sure, I can do that in 10 minutes, but also here are all of the conceptual things that I can talk about. And I think sometimes being able to just have those conversations with faculty allow me to get in the door.
Yeah. And then we have the question about whether or not there are other studies supporting our findings. The findings that we had are largely consistent with existing literature coming from a variety of different areas, the couple of things that we found that are distinct and additional research will have to be conducted are really the sense of overwhelm throughout the process that doesn't wane because there's a limited number of study of this issue of the holistic research process with the graduate student population explicitly. And that just hasn't been delved into particularly well in the existing literature. And it definitely was different than other populations. And the second thing that we found is that when you're looking at the research process holistically, the subject discipline differences really didn't matter. And that's definitely different than the existing research looking explicitly at the literature review process. And that makes a certain amount of sense that like, if we're just thinking about the literature review, that there would be disciplinary or subject conventions that would come into play, that if we're maybe thinking about the experience of the whole research process, you know, it's the, like when you're looking at a discrete piece and it's more focused, there may be more minutia, but when you're looking sort of broadly, the focus is a little bit different. And so, you know, some of those pieces smooth out a little bit. Wendy, I think you have your hand up.
I do, thank you. One of the things I wanted to say, that the simplest thing that I do in workshops, I'm the embedded librarian for boot camp, as well as having my own workshop series. I do 3 in boot camp, mapping, searching, and lit review. They're all 90 minutes. And I start every single one of them the same way. I say, all right, we're going to have a leisurely session as we talk about this. And just saying it's a leisurely session, I and everybody else in the room goes, ah, simply because I am tired of being rushed through everything. And if this were simple, we wouldn't even have to talk about it, right? So let's just acknowledge that there's going to be a tricky piece, but it's all going to be fine. And if I don't take the full 90 minutes, that's okay. But if I need it, I've got it. I really am just exhausted of being rushed by people to try to do something complicated in a very brief way. And I don't think it's fair as faculty to even be asked to do that. And that's a tangent I won't go on. Okay, so thank you. And also, I don't know how to unraise my hand. I apologize. Oh, yes, I do. I see it. Okay, thank you.
All right, guys, I want to just give you a huge thank you for giving us such an engaging presentation here. For those of us that are here and maybe want to look back on this later, the recording will be posted on our YouTube channel.
Elaine, I think we lost your mic.
Sorry, I don't know how I got muted again. So I just dropped the YouTube link into the chat if you guys want to check out the previous recordings. Our next webinar is going to be on Monday, April 24th, also at noon my time. So if you guys will be on the lookout for advertising for that. If you guys want to give us a follow on Twitter, we're at TLGS16. So that's where I usually drop a lot of our marketing in addition to some listservs. And so with that, I will let you guys have the rest of your hour back, unless you guys want to keep it open for some questions. I'll stop the recording.
Yeah, we just